So we are discussing essay number 3, which is the final essay. You have, if I'm not mistaken, 3 options. The first one is write a critique of a linguistic essay evaluating a specific subject dealing with language and language myths. Examine your subject clearly as you evaluate it. Give reasons for your evaluations based on criteria and standards within the scope of linguistics to evaluate your subject. Support your evaluation with examples and details using the worksheet provided. So the overall structure of a critique: identify the topic of your interest, one that has strengths and weaknesses, view and review, use linguistic criteria to analyze and identify the article of your choice, present the subject clearly and thoroughly in terms of the writer's purpose, audience, and the genre of the text, assess the writer's main argument and its effectiveness, see how you can frame or reframe the topic based on your thinking and your audience. There are some basic examples. For instance, although Anderson's argument for universality of grammar is a significant contribution, it falls short of whatever. Many linguists are probably familiar with Anderson's work about universality of grammar. However, they may be curious to know what other linguists have to say about this very topic. So there are examples of how to frame basically your claim or your thesis. You want to formulate a thesis statement about your overall evaluation. Chomsky's work is a unique embodiment of generative linguistics that still holds promise to enable us to gain new insights into the human mind and the role of language as innate capacity, which is the topic for actually claim number 9. Generative linguists such as Chomsky have made many contributions to our understanding of language as an innate capacity. However, sociolinguists such as Lebov consider the study of a relation between language and society as the most crucial contribution that linguists can make. And throughout this course, someone had brought up definitions. Definitely, we have come across many definitions, many fields of linguistics, including sociolinguistics, generative linguistics, neurolinguistics, cognitive, basically science, innatism, mentalism, psycholinguistics, you just name it, which is actually the topic for today. So form and develop reasons and evidence to support your claim or thesis. Argue if the key ideas are well supported with reason to show the merits and limitations of the main argument of the source text in terms of responding to alternative arguments. So for instance, Chomsky's universal grammar can be appreciated by most because of its innovative and deductive approach, scientific argument, and probing analysis of language. More of the sources that we have read, Rambaugh and Sue Savage. Rambaugh, in analyzing research on primates and language, argument demonstrates that some primates have the full capacity for language, but their competencies still, as they have noted, cannot compete with human language. And then I have some sources that, in terms of different types of arguments, I have provided you with these resources elsewhere. So there are different types of arguments that one could use. Classical argument, Tolman argument, which is primarily based on a claim that has to be qualified. It is based on warrant. It is based on data or evidence to support the claim. It is a philosophical, perhaps, perspective, let's put it this way. And then you have a Rogerian argument, which is yet to be accepted in the Anglophone argumentation. The Rogerian argument basically tries to find common grounds or commonalities rather than divide basically the camp into opponents and proponents. So it really looks for common basically grounds, so to speak. And rhetorical strategies, rhetoric or rhetorical situation primarily looks at the audience, the purpose, the genre. It is primarily looking at the old, perhaps Aristotelian notions of pathos, ethos, and logos for a balanced argumentation to be presented. There is something about types of evidence that you could bring to bear on your arguments, such as textual evidence, sources, statistics, contrast, comparison. Obviously, there are different ways or different strategies to develop an argument, including, but not limited to, for instance, definition. That is very important, how we define our terms, description, explanation, comparison and contrast, cause and effect, persuasion. All these are different basically ways of expanding or strategies to develop our ideas. And I would say when it comes to academic discourse and academic writing, fundamentally, the most significant skills, and you probably have acquired these skills, would involve paraphrasing, summarizing, and using quotations, both direct and indirect. And that is how you bring authoritative sources into your own text. Using sources definitely would augment your argument, not diminish it, as long as you acknowledge, recognize, and cite basically your source according to MLA, or rather APA conventions. So this is one option. Another option is you could go ahead and do it on the US official basically language policy. If you have a different option in mind, if you don't like any of these topics, you could let us know. But the US does not have an official language. We talked about this. You could pick this one alternatively, or you could pick the topic of bilingualism as a controversial topic. So these are the options basically that you have. If you're not happy with any of these options, I would encourage you basically to approach us with your choice of the topic, as long as it is related to the theme and one of the claims that we have looked at throughout basically the course. Keep in mind that this is a source-based essay, and definitely you have to find at least 3 academic sources, I would say, whether from the sources that we have read or from the sources that you could find on your own, or it could be a combination of both. So it is important that you stick to APA conventions and definitely using those sources to lend more credence to your argument. Initially, what I had in mind was basically the critique of an article or 2 articles, but that is my personal preference, but I do not really want to impose it on you. I think generally you have done a good job when it comes to essay number 1 and essay number 2, and I don't see any reason why you should not be able to handle and tackle essay number 3. But the only difference between these essays is here you really have to show a greater capability, not only in your rhetorical analysis, but in using basically linguistic ideas to present, to represent, and to advance your central argument. Any questions? In terms of basically time, of course, you were supposed to have submitted, the first draft of the essay. So this is one of those areas of flexibility that I was talking about. You definitely have to wrap up the first draft of the essay in a matter of 10, no more than 2 weeks, so that we have sufficient time for revision. When it comes to the other essays, you have the freedom to revise your work and resubmit the work for a better grade. What counts is really the improvement in the quality of the work. So that applies to all the essays that you have written and you're going to write in this class. Any questions? If there are no questions, Max, should we begin the debate?
So no breakout rooms today?
We could definitely, it is a good start. I belatedly, I was, again, that was a legitimate thing about using Nearpod. When I just got home, I created and I emailed, I don't know if everyone received the email about the relation between language and the mind. So it is active now. If anyone basically in the breakout rooms or in the process wants to post a note about the relation, I did mine. So let's form the breakout rooms. Should we give the breakout rooms 5 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. Time now is 1:12.
What happened? What is it?
Okay, so we are back to have our discussion, or rather debate, Max.
Or so somebody asked me a question. They asked, since there's nobody on the con side, how are they supposed to write their counter arguments for their write-up?
I think, this brings up the whole question of pretending or assuming the opposite stance. And one of the essays, actually, which I wanted to, I was tempted to try, and if there's anyone who wants to try this, it's not a bad idea. Just assuming as the side that you are definitely against or in favor of. That would create basically a semblance that may not really be easy, but it is challenging. Or imagining the counter basically argument. So just for the sake of argument, pretending that you have the opposite view, that no, language is external to the human mind. It is not intrinsic. It is not internal. That language is learned consciously, directly. And obviously you have to take a more interactionist, for instance, approach to say that language is acquired through interaction. It is wrong. The Chomsky notion that language is bioprogrammed into the human brain, that you could argue either behavioristically or when it comes to interactionism, that definitely there is evidence to suggest that language is learned in and through social interaction. And it comes to maturation through that process rather than being an innate mechanism as it is claimed by generativists. So I see the dilemma, but one could challenge oneself and other people by taking on the opposite view.
Okay. So for the counter arguments, we don't have any in the debate. I guess you could just play devil's advocate on your own and look at some of the counter arguments that are out there and write them as your counter argument for your write-up. All right. So that being said, let's start the discussion. So who would like to go first? Got a lot of people listed.
I can go.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So I think a person's culture and language impacts the way that people think, just because in people's culture, traditions, values, beliefs, and customs are shared. And like for me personally, like I've learned to like respect my elders and act a certain way. And like I guess the way that I view respect and like other moral values has been heavily influenced by my Hispanic culture. So I think that's true. in many cultures, like the way you act and the way you treat people and the way you talk is heavily influenced by what you're taught as a kid growing up by your culture.
Okay.
I'd
So
like to go. Oh,
no,
sorry.
go ahead.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'd like to go off on that aspect because in Spanish, it is a very male-based, I would say. Many verbs and many other words are based in the male pronoun. And so I would like to point out how in most Spanish-speaking countries, so Hispanic countries, it is very male biased. And even within the family, sometimes it can be very obvious that the son is valued more than the daughter. And being raised like that with how I spoke Spanish and learned Spanish, I thought that that was normal. So that was the culture I grew up with, knowing that male is more valued than a female. And so I think before I was able to fully understand what I was being taught, I think I was greatly influenced by the Spanish speaking system and thinking that males were more valued.
And you think that was you think that language contributed to that notion?
Yes, when I was little, I definitely didn't think twice and just knew males were supposed to be valued more until I grew older and understand that that's not true.
Okay.
To add on, in Spanish, there's a lot of like formal and informal ways of saying things, and you're expected to use the formal way when speaking to like your grandparents and your parents, rather than if you're speaking to like a friend. Like you're supposed to use like usted for your grandparents and tú for like your friends. You don't say y tú to your elders because that's disrespectful, and I feel like that's rooted in like in the culture that it comes from.
To add on to that, I said that language and culture shapes the way we think, because if you look at sentence structures, they're very different depending on the language that you speak. For example, the English or the typical English sentence structure is subject, verb, object, while correct me if I'm wrong, professor, but I think the Kurdish sentence structure is subject, object, verb.
That's correct,
Is
yes.
Yes. So yeah, I think that influences the way that you think,
How so?
because sometimes like my grandparents, they don't speak English, they speak Korean. So sometimes when they're at like drive-throughs in Korean, the sentence structure is subject, object, verb. So instead of, oh, one hamburger, please, he would just like say hamburger one, please, because that is how you say it in like Korean, like the sentence structure. So I guess in that aspect, he thinks differently, and therefore he speaks differently.
To add on to that, there's also like grammatical gender that shapes the way that some languages see objects or like nouns. So like in the German language, it's feminine. The sun is feminine and the moon is masculine. And then in Spanish, it's the opposite. The sun is masculine and the moon is feminine. So there's also grammatical gender that influences that.
Right.
Another way language and culture can affect how you think is also the way you speak the language. So in American culture, people kind of look at standard English as the correct way. So if someone would speak like African American vernacular or speak in a Southern or New York accent, they would look down upon them. And like, for example, in a job interview, they'd rather choose someone who would speak formal standard English instead of a different accent. So in that way, that's how people kind of think differently about others in the way they speak.
Now, does speaking a certain dialect, have any influence on how you think? I know that we did talk about this a little bit with the Korean, but do you think that speaking AAVE in and of itself would have any influence on how you think as the speaker?
Yes, I feel like it would. Like, for example, they can think of themselves as kind of like either there's two, like they can either think of their own dialect as kind of like the incorrect way, and they can like think bad about themselves, kind of have think less of themselves, or they can be strengthened by their unity in their community, because they're kind of more united in because of their language.
Okay. Or, yeah, that's a good point, definitely.
I definitely would agree too that that would have an effect on how you think, depending on like your dialect or just the language you're speaking, especially because language is a big part to play in how we kind of process things for ourselves. So even if we're not talking to another person, it could still be like, you know, you speak to yourself in your mind, and even the ways of speaking that you're used to, I think, go into play as your thoughts. So I think that if you have different, if there's like different, how am I trying to say this, like biases, or if you're just kind of more affected by the influence of the language, it could change the way that you think.
I just wanted to include that one way that language and culture could be shown to shape how we think would be different humor. I think the humor in different cultures widely, like they're very different in other cultures. And if, like, for example, I'm half Cambodian, so half my family speaks in Khmer, and when they're telling jokes and stuff, like I don't know why they're laughing. I don't understand. But when it is translated, and I still might not understand because the culture, like the Khmer culture, it's quite different from American culture. So language and context, like they can affect one's humor, which influences how we think.
I want to add on to that as well, because there was a TED Talk on Beachboard somewhere of a girl named Ayana, I believe is how it's pronounced. And she was talking about how we want to share things that we find funny or interesting and stuff like that with other people in our culture. And if someone, say, doesn't understand our language or our dialect, the cultural things that we find funny, it doesn't register and it doesn't connect us as well. And it kind of reminded me, I actually have a meme saved in my phone that I had saved originally. I thought it was funny, but I had saved it just because it was written in French and I was impressed that I understood it. So it was just something I was proud of. But I realized when she was talking about that, about cultural different things that we understand based on where we're from, what language we speak and stuff like that, that there were so many different layers to that meme that wouldn't translate to someone else, I don't think, not only because it was written in a different language, but because it talks about YouTube culture, things that older generations might not understand as well as we do in our generation. And it talks about Greek mythology, which does, I think, is more widely known throughout different generations, but it could definitely, depending on where you live and stuff like that, I think certain people would understand it more than other people would. And so I just thought it was interesting to look at it from that perspective, because I didn't realize how many layers of understanding went with this picture that I just had saved in my phone.
I wanted to add that, like, just like talking about what she was talking about, like with culture, in some cultures, like it's easily talked in like talking sarcastically. So like if you're in your culture, you feel like you're talking sarcastically, and then when you go and talk to someone else, like they don't understand because they think you're like being mean to them in a way when you're actually not. You're just trying to speak to them.
Yeah, I feel like they either don't understand or they take it as offensive because they're just not used to that language being used in their culture.
I just wanted to add that in the book Nature of Language, Warfoot argued that the grammatical categories of differing language led their speakers to think about things in particular ways. So, for example, English divides time into past, present, and future, while a language from Pueblo region of the Native American Southwest, known as Hopi, does not. They instead distinguish events that existed or that have existed or that exist. Therefore, the way that English speakers and Hopi speakers think about time and reality are completely different. So while some think about as so some individuals talk in future tense while others don't, and they recognize that future is not certain. So that's why they don't like speak it or think about it.
Yeah, that was a very interesting example from Hopi. Was it right? That, for instance, in English, if we want to say something such as, for instance, I made the horse run, in Hopi, they would say, I got the horse to run. On the surface, you would say, oh, these semantically more or less have the same meaning. But it could be argued that, for instance, I made the horse run arises from a philosophy of being in the world, or ontology that is based on compulsion and force and necessity, that there is an external, basically, force that motivates movements of everything. Whereas, for instance, in Hopi, they would say, I encouraged, I urged, I got the horse to run. It is more the power of persuasion rather than external force. So this has been basically used as an example to show how different linguistic systems, operate differently. And many of you provided some examples. An example that I came across when I was doing ethnography and in Iranian American Heritage School, where they were teaching Iranian American children how to write in Persian. And I have learned basically Persian as a foreign language myself. So I had experienced what Iranian American children were experiencing in Los Angeles. This was some time ago. So whenever teachers came upon beautiful handwriting or penmanship of a child, they would say, "Has kardam." Has kardam is essentially, it is delightful. It is such a joy to see that. So I took it lightly, only to realize when I began to write actually my whole dissertation about this topic, that it has so many different shades of meanings not found in English. So I found a range of really meanings from esoteric to erotic meaning in this has kardam. Has is pronounced in the same way as the English possessive verb have, has kardam. It means literally, I enjoyed it. So definitely it had a range of meanings, but when I wanted to impart this basically semantic really knowledge to English readers, I had to be more explicit what it meant. I ended up writing about 2-3 pages. But the question is, when English basically readers read my text, are they able, for instance, to see the cultural role of Khoshnavissi or elegant writing. They will probably see it, but it would be very difficult for them to appreciate because it has become somewhat invisible or too commercialized in the American culture. You know, we have it. We are embedded in this kind of technology now. Actually, beginning with Zoom and Beachboard fonts. You know, every time you want to pick a font, it is one of these. It is penmanship in a way, which has evolved. The technologies of writing. But my take is definitely English readers could appreciate, could understand. Not, I'm not sure about appreciating, but they can understand where I'm coming from. So this relation between culture and language definitely is, as many of you suggested, definitely is there. You cannot ignore that. But does language shape the way we think? Again, there is no doubt that definitely that is a question. But is human mind entirely shaped by language? That question remains to be really discussed. There is this Whorfian hypothesis, I don't know if you have come across that, that makes such a claim. But most linguists and anthropologists would take a balanced approach. And they would say that that is too exaggerated or too strong a claim to say that the human mind is shaped by language or the ways in which we use language.
So we have one judge here today. That is a Megan. So I know we only have one side, so it's kind of moot. But what's your opinion? I guess.
Can I make a point before we go to the judges?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Adding on to what Anna was saying about the Spanish language being very masculine, I think language shapes the way we think because you only think about the things you have a vocabulary for. And since the Spanish vocabulary is very masculine, it shapes the way we think. And according to dictionary.com, linguistic relativity is part of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is the structure of a language determines a native speaker's perception and categorization of experience. And so our language does shape the way we think, and culture also shapes the way we think. For example, Asian culture is very collectivist, and Western culture is very independent and is based on individualism. And that's kind of how we think.
If I could just jump in briefly, if that is the case, for instance, Persian, for instance, the Persian language, there is no distinction in the pronoun system between he and she, right? English makes that kind of distinction. So if there is no grammatical distinction between genders, or it is not as masculine and feminine as, for instance, Spanish, for that matter, is, does that mean women in Iran suffer less from patriarchy and repression of the system? By no means. So the question is really, is there a connection between the grammatical system of gender and gender repression in a country? That doesn't really mean that we shouldn't try to make the language more neutral, but I mean, the question is there a connection between the two? In one language you don't, but women are more oppressed in that country where you don't have grammatical gender, so to speak, than probably many other countries where you do have, as you said, you know, this kind of masculine, feminine distinction in the grammatical system.
Yeah, well, that is the funny thing, because women are more oppressed in like Asian countries than here, yet there's no really pronouns in their languages.
Exactly.
Okay, so now Judge Megan, what's your opinion?
I think it's obvious that the pro side had to win because there was no con, but I liked this debate because it was like the evidence that was used to argue each side was very like diverse. A lot of people argued different points and went off of each other. So I think this debate really showed how even though there wasn't an equal number of people on each side, people could still argue different topics and not overlap.
Right. Okay, so that's the debate. So Dr. Sharifi, do you have anything to say before we close?
No, actually, I agree with Megan. Even though basically we didn't have the opposing side, but every presenter somewhat invoked the opposing side as well. So there was more or less a balanced presentation. And I like the ways in which basically different multiple sources and the type of evidence that was brought to bear on the arguments. And fortunately, these debates are becoming more sophisticated as we go along. Unfortunately, they will end soon.
Okay. So I think that's all we have for you today. So your essay, you need to, when's the essay due again?
The essay for the first draft, if they have been working on it, we posted basically the prompt last week. So they could post it anytime. For the first draft, they do have about 10 days. And I'm going to put that in writing. And if the general preference is to make everything time constrained, primarily for the sake of greater clarity, I have no problem with that. But I have left basically some assignments such as the essays, not really time constrained for giving everyone the time to explore, these topics and resubmit the work. And I think if everyone agrees, we are going to stick to that schedule. But definitely you have to have a timeline. Keep in mind that you may have to revise and you want to give yourself more time. So let's not go beyond 2 weeks at most for the completion of the first draft.
Okay. All right. So I think that's all we have for you guys. Thank you very much. I enjoyed this debate and I hope you all did too. And have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you, you too.
What debate are we going to be doing next week, or which claim?
I think since we go ahead, Max.
I think we'll do claim 8 on bilingual education.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
I have a
Thank
good
you.
Professor, I just had one question.
Mm-hmm.
For the essay 2, I didn't want to rush you or anything. I just wanted to know when you're going
Did you
to be.
resubmit it?
Yes, I did. So I was just curious when you were going to look it over.
I will once I have time, because I've been busy with midterms from multiple courses that I've been teaching. So I will definitely in a day or two.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.